Welcome and relax. Take a moment to settle in, breathe deeply, and let your mind drift. Feel the quiet around you, the gentle rhythm of your thoughts, and the calm that surrounds this moment. Listen and simply be. Before money, before markets, before trade itself had a word, humans still exchanged things, but they didn't think of it as trade. In the earliest human communities, survival came first. Everything else was secondary. Food, shelter, warmth, these were not commodities. They were necessities, shared or withheld depending on circumstance. If someone hunted successfully, the meat rarely belonged to them alone. A single human could not consume it all before it spoiled. Sharing wasn't generosity, it was practicality. Refusing to share meant isolation. Isolation meant death. So the earliest form of trade wasn't barter, it wasn't negotiation, it was mutual dependence. People shared because they had to. In small hunter-gatherer groups, everyone knew everyone else. There were no strangers, no anonymity. Memory replaced record-keeping. If you helped today, it was remembered tomorrow. If you took too much, it was noticed. Value wasn't measured in objects, it was measured in relationships. A skilled hunter was valuable not because of what he owned, but because of what he could provide. A healer was valuable because of knowledge, a toolmaker because of skill. Nothing had a fixed price. Everything had context. When food was abundant, generosity increased. When resources were scarce, sharing tightened. Exchange adjusted itself naturally without rules written down. Time played a role too. If someone gave you something today, you didn't immediately give something back. That would have been strange, even insulting. Instead, the debt lingered. Not as a number, but as a feeling, an understanding. Anthropologists call this a gift economy, but early humans didn't think in those terms. They simply lived inside a web of obligation and trust. And trust was everything. Without trust, exchange collapsed. You couldn't trade with someone you didn't believe would remember. There were no contracts, no enforcement. Reputation was the only currency. As human groups grew larger, these systems became more complex. Not everyone could hunt, not everyone could gather, not everyone had the same skills. Specialization slowly emerged. Some people became better at making tools, others at tracking animals, others at navigating terrain or remembering seasonal patterns. And when specialization appeared, exchange became more intentional. You didn't just share, you relied on others for what you couldn't do yourself. Still, there was no bargaining. No one said, "I'll give you this if you give me that." Instead, there was expectation. You helped because you were part of the group, and the group helped you in return, eventually. Time softened all debts. As humans began settling in one place, this balance shifted again. Permanent settlements meant stored food. Stored food meant inequality. Some families had more, some had less. Suddenly, not everyone needed to share equally. Exchange became less automatic, and that's when something new appeared. Choice. People began choosing who to help, when to help, how much to give. Exchange slowly separated from survival and moved towards social structure. Gifts became signals. Giving too much could elevate status. Giving too little could damage trust. Trade wasn't about goods yet. It was about standing. If someone consistently provided, they gained influence. If someone consumed without contributing, they were watched. Nothing was written, nothing was calculated, everything was felt. This emotional accounting system worked, but only within small groups. Once communities began interacting with outsiders, everything changed, because memory doesn't extend beyond familiarity, and trust doesn't survive distance. In the next batch, we'll explore how humans began exchanging with people they didn't know, and how trade slowly separated from relationships and became something more fragile and more powerful. Before coins, before paper bills, before numbers ruled value, trade was not a transaction, it was a relationship. Modern people imagine early trade as simple barter. You have fish, I have grain, let's swap. But real prehistoric trade almost never worked that way. Because direct barter has a problem that shows up immediately. You need double coincidence of wants. Both people must want what the other has at the same time in the right amount at the right moment. That almost never happens. Early humans figured this out quickly, so instead of trading objects, they traded obligations. Trade as memory, not exchange. In early societies, value lived inside people's heads. If you gave someone food today, you didn't expect an immediate return. You expected remembering. Memory was currency. Anthropologists call this a gift economy, but the word gift is misleading. These were not free offerings. They were social debts. When a hunter shared meat with the group, everyone remembered. When a farmer lent grain during a bad season, that favor stayed alive for years. The return might come later, in a different form, from a different person, but it always came, because forgetting was dangerous. Reputation was everything. In a world without money, reputation replaced wealth. People knew who shared, who hoarded, who repaid favors, who disappeared when times were hard. A generous person gained allies. A selfish one became isolated, and isolation meant death. You didn't survive alone in early human societies, so trade worked because social pressure enforced it. No courts, no contracts, no receipts, just memory, gossip, and shame. The power of delayed exchange. This system was surprisingly efficient. Imagine a fisherman on the coast and a farmer inland. They don't meet often. They don't want the same things at the same time, so instead, the fisherman gives fish when he has abundance. The farmer gives grain later during harvest. No counting, no exact ratios, only balance over time. If one side consistently took more than they gave, the relationship broke, and broken relationships meant no future help. Ceremonial trade more than goods. Some early trade didn't even pretend to be practical. Objects were exchanged not for use, but for meaning. Shells, feathers, polished stones, animal teeth. These items often had no survival function, but they carried status. Owning them showed who you were connected to, how far your network reached, that others trusted you. In many societies, these objects circulated constantly. They were never kept forever. Value came from movement, not possession. The Kula ring, trade without profit. One of the clearest examples comes from the Kula ring in the Pacific Islands. Tribes sailed dangerous routes to exchange two items. Shell necklaces circulated clockwise, and shell armbands circulated counterclockwise. They were never sold, never kept permanently, never used. Their purpose was relationship maintenance. The act of giving proved trust. The act of receiving created obligation. The act of passing it on kept the system alive. No one got richer, but everyone stayed connected. Trade as social technology. Before money, trade solved problems money can't. It reduced conflict, created alliances, spread resources during scarcity, linked distant communities, and it did all this without numbers. Trade wasn't about fairness in the moment, it was about balance over a lifetime. A young hunter might take more than he gives, an elder might give more than he receives. The system adjusted naturally. Why hoarding didn't work. In early trade systems, hoarding was pointless. You couldn't store food long term, you couldn't protect wealth alone, you couldn't move freely without allies. The safest place for value wasn't a cave, it was other people. Your wealth was how many people owed you, how many trusted you, how many would help when things went wrong. That's why generosity looked like strength. The first cracks in the system. But this system had limits. As populations grew, memory became unreliable, relationships became indirect, trade expanded beyond kin and tribe. You couldn't rely on reputation alone when dealing with strangers. If someone from another village cheated you, there was no shared memory, no shared punishment. Trust became fragile. That's when societies began searching for something new, something that didn't depend on memory, something that worked between strangers, something portable, durable, recognizable, something that could stand in for trust. That search would slowly lead humanity towards money, but money did not replace trade. It replaced relationships, and that changed everything. As human societies grew larger, trade began to stretch beyond memory. Villages turned into networks, networks turned into regions, and something subtle broke. You could no longer know everyone. When trade stayed inside a small group, reputation worked. But once strangers entered the system, reputation became fragile. A traveler could cheat you and simply leave. No consequences, no shared memory, no punishment. So humans did what they always do. They invented substitutes for trust. The birth of proto-money. Before money existed, certain objects began behaving like money, not officially, not by law, but by habit. These objects shared a few critical traits. Everyone recognized them. They were hard to fake. They didn't spoil. They could be carried. They held value outside the transaction. Anthropologists call these proto-money. They weren't money yet, but they were no longer just symbolic gifts. Why food rarely became currency? At first, food seems like an obvious choice. Everyone needs it, everyone values it. But food fails quickly. It spoils, it varies in quality, it's heavy, it's seasonal. A bag of grain today is not the same next month. So while food remained central to survival, it rarely became a stable medium of exchange. Humans needed something more durable. Shells, the first widely accepted money. One of the earliest proto-currencies was shells, especially cowrie shells. They were hard to find inland, difficult to counterfeit, uniform in size, visually distinct. Most importantly, they had no survival use, which made them perfect. You couldn't eat them, you couldn't rely on them to survive. Their value came purely from social agreement. That made them stable. Shells spread across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, sometimes traveling thousands of kilometers from the ocean. People accepted them not because they were useful, but because everyone else accepted them. Beads, stones, and prestige objects. Other societies used beads, polished stones, obsidian blades, jade ornaments. These objects carried both aesthetic and social value. Owning them signaled status, connections, access to distant trade routes. They were proof that you were trusted by others. Trade stopped being purely practical, it became symbolic. Livestock as living currency. In pastoral societies, animals became units of value. Cattle, goats, sheep. They reproduced, they moved on their own, they provided food, labor, and status. Bride prices, blood compensation, peace treaties, all measured in animals. But livestock had a problem. They got sick, they died, they required care. You couldn't carry 10 cows in your pocket. Metal changes everything. Eventually, humans discovered something extraordinary: metal. At first, metal wasn't used for money, it was used for tools and weapons. But metal had unique properties: durable, divisible, scarce, reusable, meltable. A broken metal tool could be reforged. Value could survive destruction. That was revolutionary. The first metal value objects. Early metal trade didn't use coins. It used rings, bars, blades, ingots. They were weighed, not counted. Value was in mass, not markings. If a piece was too big, it was cut. If it was damaged, it was melted. Trade became more precise, but still local. Why standardization was inevitable. As trade expanded further, weighing metal became inconvenient. Scales could be manipulated, weights could be cheated, disputes became common. So societies began doing something radical. They stamped authority onto metal. A symbol, a mark, a face. This stamp said, "This piece weighs what it claims. This piece is accepted by power." This was not just convenience, it was control. Proto-money versus real money. Proto-money still depended on social acceptance, but stamped metal introduced something new: central trust. You no longer trusted the person, you trusted the symbol, the tribe, the city, the ruler. Money was no longer social memory, it was political technology. And once that door opened, it never closed. The trade-off humanity made. By replacing relationships with objects, trade became faster, scalable, stranger-friendly. But it lost something. Trade no longer created bonds. It settled accounts and ended interactions. You paid, you left, you owed nothing. For the first time in history, humans could be economically connected and socially disconnected, and that would reshape civilization. Next came markets, then states, then empires, and all of it rested on this simple idea: value could exist outside human memory. Once objects began standing in for trust, trade no longer needed familiarity. That single change reshaped everything. Before this moment, exchange required relationships. You traded with people you knew or people connected to someone you trusted. Distance weakened trade. Strangers were dangerous. But proto-money, shells, metals, livestock, prestige objects, made exchange portable. Value could travel without its owner, and that allowed something new to form: markets. The first markets were not planned. Early markets didn't begin as economic institutions, they began as gatherings, seasonal meetings, religious festivals, ritual celebrations. People came together for reasons unrelated to trade, but whenever people gathered, exchange followed naturally. Hunters brought surplus meat. Farmers brought grain. Craftspeople brought tools and ornaments. At first, trade was informal. Gifts were exchanged alongside goods. Negotiation was quiet. embedded in conversation. But over time, patterns emerged. Certain places became known for certain goods. Certain days became known for exchange. Markets slowly stabilized. Why markets needed neutral ground? Early markets were often placed in neutral or sacred locations, not inside one village, not under one ruler. Neutral ground reduced conflict. No one had home advantage, no one controlled the rules completely. Temples often served this role. Religion helped enforce honesty. Cheating near sacred spaces risked spiritual punishment. Gods became silent regulators of trade. Trust shifted again, not to people, not yet to rulers, but to belief. Prices before price tags. Even in early markets, prices were not fixed. They fluctuated with scarcity, season, distance, and social status. Two people could pay different prices for the same good. A stranger might pay more, an ally might pay less. Value was negotiated every time, and negotiation was not just economic, it was social performance. Too aggressive, and you looked dangerous. Too passive, and you looked weak. Skill in negotiation became a survival trait. Trade and the rise of specialists. Markets allowed specialization to accelerate. People no longer needed to produce everything they consumed. One person could focus entirely on pottery, another on weaving, another on metalwork. Trade supported them. This increased efficiency, but also dependence. You could no longer survive alone. Your life depended on strangers. That dependence created vulnerability, which meant protection became necessary. The emergence of trade control. As markets grew, powerful figures stepped in, chiefs, priests, later kings. They offered protection from theft, from violence, from cheating. In exchange, they demanded a share. Taxes, tithes, fees. Trade began feeding power. Markets were no longer just places of exchange, they were sources of wealth extraction. When trade turned unequal. Before money, exchange was often balanced socially, but markets introduced inequality quickly. Those who controlled land, storage, trade routes accumulated more. Those without access became dependent. Wealth could now be stored and protected, which meant it could be inherited. For the first time, inequality became permanent. Trade routes without money. Even before formal currencies, long-distance trade exploded. Obsidian traveled hundreds of kilometers. Amber moved from northern Europe to the Mediterranean. Spices crossed deserts and seas. These exchanges rarely used barter. Instead, trade chains formed. Goods passed through many hands, each exchange slightly transformed value. Trust wasn't between individuals, it was between systems. Break the chain, and everything collapsed. The silent cost of expansion. As trade scaled up, something was lost. Earlier systems forced repeated interaction. Markets allowed brief encounters. You could trade once and never see the person again. This reduced social accountability. Cheating became profitable, so enforcement had to evolve. Rules were written, weights standardized, punishments formalized. Trade moved from social memory to legal structure. Money's quiet invasion. At first, money didn't replace trade systems, it coexisted. People still gifted, still bartered, still relied on relationships. But money had one powerful advantage. It ended obligations. You paid, and you were free. No memory required, no relationship maintained. And that convenience slowly reshaped human behavior. People preferred clean exits, short interactions, no lingering debts. Trade became faster and colder. A turning point. By the time money became common, societies had already changed. Markets were normalized, strangers were expected, authority regulated exchange. Money didn't cause this transformation, it finalized it. Before coins, before bills, before numbers written on paper, trade survived on something far more fragile: trust. In early human societies, exchange didn't always happen instantly. You didn't always trade grain for meat. You didn't always swap now. Sometimes you waited, and that waiting changed everything. Imagine a small village near a river. One family fishes, another grows grain, another raises goats. The fisherman brings extra fish one morning, but the farmer's harvest won't be ready for months. So instead of walking away empty-handed, the fisherman leaves fish anyway, not because he's careless, but because he remembers, and because the village remembers. This is where trade quietly evolves into credit. The first IOU. Long before written contracts, debt existed, but it didn't live on paper. It lived in memory. You gave something now, trusting that something would return later. Not equal, not exact, but fair. Everyone knew who had given, everyone knew who still owed, and everyone knew what happened to those who didn't repay. In small communities, reputation was currency. If you failed to repay a debt, people stopped trading with you. You were excluded from future exchanges. You lost protection and support. In extreme cases, you were forced to leave. So most people repaid, not because of law, but because survival depended on belonging. Trade without numbers. There were no ledgers, no interest rates, no deadlines, but there was a shared sense of balance. If you took too much and gave too little, the imbalance was felt. Over time, villages developed unwritten rules: how long a debt could last, what counted as a fair return, when generosity became exploitation. Trade wasn't mathematical, it was social. Anthropologists found that in many early societies, exact value didn't matter. What mattered was relationship continuity. You didn't trade to maximize profit. You traded to ensure future cooperation. The goal wasn't wealth. The goal was stability. Why delayed exchange was powerful. Delayed exchange allowed specialization. A hunter could focus on hunting, a potter could focus on pottery, a farmer could focus on crops. They didn't need to match needs perfectly every day. They trusted the system. This trust allowed larger communities more complex skills, better tools, safer food supply, all without money. But trust had limits. As villages grew, memory started to fail. When memory couldn't keep up. In a village of 30 people, everyone knows everything. In a village of 300, things get blurry. Who owes whom? How much? From how long ago? Stories replaced memory. Elders became living records. They remembered past exchanges, family obligations, old debts. Their authority wasn't political, it was economic. Some societies went further. They turned memory into ritual. Debt as ceremony. In certain cultures, debts were announced publicly. Feasts, gatherings, storytelling nights. Someone would say, 3 seasons ago, this family helped us survive the drought. The reminder wasn't embarrassing, it was respectful. It reinforced obligation without threat. Repayment wasn't rushed, but it was expected. This public acknowledgement acted like an early ledger. No numbers, no writing, just collective awareness. When trust broke, Of course, not everyone played fair. Some people took and never returned. And when that happened, communities adapted. They introduced witnesses during exchanges, physical tokens to mark debt, symbols tied to promises, a carved stick, a knotted rope, a marked stone. Not money, but memory aids. These objects didn't hold value, they held meaning. They said, this transaction exists and it will be remembered. The emotional weight of debt. Debt wasn't just economic, it was emotional. To owe someone was to carry a burden. To be owed was to hold quiet power. People repaid not just to settle accounts, but to restore balance in relationships. This is why early debt often avoided exact equivalence. Over-repayment was common. It showed gratitude. It reinforced bonds. In many cultures, generosity was admired more than fairness. Giving extra raised your status. Being known as reliable made others want to trade with you. Trust created opportunity. The invisible economy. What's fascinating is that none of this looked like trade as we imagine it today. There were no markets, no prices, no haggling, yet goods moved constantly. Resources flowed, needs were met, all through memory, reputation, obligation, trust, an invisible economy. And this system worked until communities became too large, until strangers appeared, until trade reached beyond memory. That's when trust needed help, and that help would eventually become something new, something portable, something standardized, something we would later call money. When trust wasn't enough anymore, humans didn't abandon trade. They externalized memory. Instead of holding debt in their heads, they began placing it into objects, simple, physical, hard to forget. The problem that forced change. Villages grew. Trade expanded beyond family, beyond faces you recognized, beyond stories you remembered. A fisherman might trade with someone he'd never see again, and memory failed. Not because people were dishonest, but because there were simply too many exchanges. Trust needed a backup. Objects that meant nothing except everything. The earliest records of trade were not valuable items. They were meaningless by design. A carved stick, a notch on bone, a knotted cord, a split piece of wood. These objects had no use outside the agreement. Their power came from recognition. This mark means something happened. Tally sticks, the first accounting tool. One of the most important inventions in trade history was the tally stick, a wooden stick carved with notches representing quantities or obligations, then split in half. Each party kept one half. Only the two halves together proved the agreement. No writing, no language barrier, no numbers as we know them, just matching scars on wood. If someone tried to fake a debt, the pieces wouldn't match. If someone denied owing, the stick remembered. Why this was revolutionary? For the first time, trade no longer relied purely on memory, could survive distance and time, could involve strangers. Debt became portable, not transferable yet, but provable. This changed behavior. People became more willing to trade. Risk dropped. Trade volume increased, all without money. Knots, beads, and strings. Different cultures solved the same problem differently. In the Andes, knotted cords recorded obligations. In Africa, beads and shells marked agreements. In Asia, bamboo tallies tracked deliveries and debts. The form didn't matter. The function did. This object remembers what we might forget. These were not currencies. Important distinction. These tokens were not money. They couldn't be used by just anyone, had meaning only within a relationship, represented a specific obligation.
You couldn't walk into a village and buy food with a tally stick. It wasn't value, it was proof. When proof became power, something unexpected happened. People began respecting the token itself, not because it was valuable, but because it was recognized. If elders or authorities acknowledged a mark or tally, it carried weight beyond the original parties. This is where power enters the story. Some communities centralized record-keeping, a trusted elder, a temple, a council. They held tallies, they remembered debts, they resolved disputes. Trade was no longer purely personal, it became institutional. The birth of abstract value. When an object could represent a promise, value became abstract, not tied to food, not tied to tools, tied to future action. This was a massive mental leap. It trained humans to think, this thing stands for something else. That idea will matter later, a lot later. The hidden cost. Abstraction created efficiency, but it also created imbalance. Those who controlled records controlled truth. If you didn't understand the system, you were vulnerable. Illiteracy, even before writing, became a disadvantage. Trust shifted from people to systems, from memory to mechanism. By now, trade had evolved through stages: immediate exchange, delayed exchange, memory-based credit, object-based record. Each step reduced friction, each step increased scale, and each step quietly moved trade away from community and toward control. The unintended consequence. Once obligations were recorded externally, they could be stored, counted, compared, accumulated. Debt could grow without face-to-face interaction, and for the first time, someone could owe many people without knowing them. This was new and dangerous. The world was ready for money, but not yet. Trade had now learned to remember, to abstract, to standardize. Only one thing was missing: a single object that everyone accepted, everyone trusted, everyone recognized instantly. That object didn't exist yet, but humans were dangerously close to inventing it.
At some point, trade outgrew memory, outgrew personal records, and outgrew trust between individuals. It needed centralization. Not because people wanted control, but because chaos had become expensive. Why central authority appeared. As villages turned into towns and towns into early cities, 3 problems emerged at once. Too many traders, too many debts, too many disputes. People needed a neutral place to store value, a trusted record keeper, a final judge when memory conflicted. The solution wasn't money, it was institutions. The temple wasn't just religious. Early temples were storehouses, banks, courts, accounting centers. They held grain, livestock, tools, and metals. People deposited goods during surplus and withdrew during scarcity, not as charity, as credit. A farmer would bring grain after harvest. The temple recorded it. Months later, he could reclaim it or trade the claim itself, not the grain, the right to grain. The first accounts, temples didn't use coins, they used ledgers, clay tablets, symbols, marks. Each entry meant this person is owed this amount. No money moved, only obligations. This was trade without physical exchange. Why everyone trusted the temple? Because temples controlled religion, law, storage, violence, indirectly. They were stable, they outlived individuals. If a temple said you were owed something, you were owed something. Trust shifted from humans to structures.
Grain became the reference unit. Not money yet, but a standard. Barley, wheat, rice. Everyone understood food. Everyone needed it. So value became measured in units of grain. Not because people paid in grain, but because it anchored abstraction. This debt equals X grain. The strange part? Most of the grain never moved. It stayed in storage. Trade happened on paper or clay. This was a virtual economy thousands of years before computers. When trade became accounting, merchants didn't carry goods across cities. They carried claims. A trader could deposit goods in one city, receive a record, travel elsewhere, exchange that record for goods. No carts, no theft risk, just trust in the institution. This changed trade forever. Scale exploded, distance stopped mattering, and power concentrated. Who controlled the records controlled reality. If you controlled the ledger, you defined who owed what. You settled disputes. You decided legitimacy. Mistakes weren't just errors. They were economic weapons. A missing entry could ruin a family. A false entry could create wealth. The birth of professional bureaucrats. Someone had to manage this system, so societies created scribes, accountants, record keepers. They didn't produce food, they didn't fight. They interpreted symbols, and that made them powerful. Knowledge itself became a resource. If you couldn't read the records, you couldn't challenge them. Trade detached from physical reality. At this point, value was no longer tangible. Exchange no longer required goods. Obligation existed as symbols. Trade had become conceptual. People trusted marks more than objects. This mental shift was irreversible. The dangerous feedback loop. As institutions grew, trade increased. Records multiplied. Control centralized, which required more institutions. Trade and power fed each other, and the system grew too complex to return to simple barter. The first cracks. But there was a problem. What if you traded outside the system? What if you met someone who didn't trust your temple? Your record meant nothing to them. Trade stalled. People needed something portable, durable, recognizable, independent of any single authority. They didn't know it yet, but they were asking for money. Almost there, but not yet. Temples solved storage, trust, accounting. They did not solve universal exchange, anonymity, or instant settlement. Those would require something radical, something small, something solid, something everyone agreed on without knowing each other.
Trade had evolved dramatically. Obligations no longer rested solely in memory. Objects could represent trust. Temples could record debts. But something still limited exchange. Distance, portability, universality. Grain was heavy. Livestock was unwieldy. Shells only worked where everyone recognized them. People needed something smaller, durable, and widely accepted. And slowly, humans found it. The power of metals. Metal was rare. Metal was durable. Metal could be shaped, divided, melted, and reshaped. It didn't spoil. It didn't decay. From bronze to copper to gold and silver, metals carried an intrinsic appeal. Not because everyone needed it, but because everyone wanted it. It became a stand-in for trust, labor, and future promise. Metal ingots, trade without objects moving. At first, metals weren't coins.
They were bars, rings, swords, tools. The value wasn't printed or stamped, it was weighed. A merchant could deposit a metal bar at one temple or city, later withdraw an equivalent elsewhere. Trade no longer required the actual goods to move. Credit became tangible. The advantages were obvious. Metals offered portability, you could carry more value in less space; durability, unlike grain, metal didn't rot; divisibility, cut a bar, keep part, trade part; recognition, distinct metals were easily identified. And for the first time, people could exchange value across strangers and cities without relying on personal memory or institutional trust. Weight became value. At this stage, trade shifted from relational value to quantitative value. A piece of silver weighed X, a bar of copper weighed Y. Value was measurable, predictable, impersonal. You no longer needed to know someone to trade, you only needed to agree on the weight and quality. Early metal tokens. Some societies experimented with symbolic markings. Not coins yet, but stamps, engravings, or simple inscriptions showed ownership, purity, authority. Even then, most metal exchange relied on trusted scales. Trust was now partially mechanical. A scale could enforce fairness in ways memory never could. Metals changed social dynamics. The rise of metal trade reshaped power. Those with access to metals gained influence. Those who controlled mining or smelting controlled trade networks. Societies that could standardize metal exchange expanded more efficiently. Trade was no longer just about survival, it was about competition, influence, and mobility. The unintended consequence. Metals made trade faster, more impersonal, and more abstract, but it also created inequality. Wealth could be stored, wealth could be accumulated, wealth could be inherited. Unlike social trust or grain sharing, metal made permanent economic advantage possible. This was a major shift from pre-money societies. Trade becomes modular. With metals, you could trade small items for large items. You could settle debts instantly across villages. You could separate value from physical goods. In effect, people were now trading contracts, not items. A mental leap. Humans were learning something new. This object stands in for value. Its worth is agreed upon, not inherent. It can move freely. It can replace memory, trust, or even authority. This is the first time in history that trade became abstracted from survival. The seeds of money are sown. Metals didn't replace all systems yet. Temples still recorded obligations. Gift-giving and delayed exchanges still existed. Markets were still tied to local norms. But metals prepared the stage. People began thinking differently about value, not as objects to be used, not as relationships to be nurtured, but as a symbol of potential, portable and exchangeable. And that is exactly what money would later formalize. The quiet revolution. Trade evolved from memory to obligation to symbolic object to metal to standardized weight to coin. Each step removed personal connection. Each step increased efficiency and scale. By the end of this phase, trade could cross distances, cultures, and even generations without trust, memory, or local authority. And yet humans were only accidentally inventing money. No one intended it. No one designed it. It was a slow, unconscious evolution. For thousands of years, humans had been trading through memory, obligations,
tokens, metals. Everything worked, but it wasn't convenient. Metal bars were heavy, proto-money varied by region, and trust still mattered in many cases. People needed something lighter, standardized, and universally recognizable. And slowly, someone had the idea. Stamp it. The first coins appear. Around 7th century BCE in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, the first coins were minted. They were small, durable, and easy to carry, and each one carried a guarantee. This coin contains a specific amount of precious metal. For the first time, trade didn't require memory, authority, or even personal trust. The coin itself proved value. Why coinage was revolutionary? Coins solved 3 problems simultaneously. Standardization. Every coin had the same weight and purity. No more arguing about bar size or grain quality. Portability. A single coin could represent months. For thousands of years, humans had been trading through memory, obligations, tokens, metals. Everything worked, but it wasn't convenient. Metal bars were heavy, proto-money varied by region, and trust still mattered in many cases. People needed something lighter, standardized, and universally recognizable. And slowly, someone had the idea. Stamp it. The first coins appear. Around 7th century BCE in Lydia, modern-day Turkey, the first coins were minted. They were small, durable, and easy to carry, and each one carried a guarantee. This coin contains a specific amount of precious metal. For the first time, trade didn't require memory, authority, or even personal trust. The coin itself proved value. Why coinage was revolutionary? Coins solved 3 problems simultaneously. Standardization. Every coin had the same weight and purity. No more arguing about bar size or grain quality. Portability. A single coin could represent months of labor. No need to carry sacks of grain or crates of metal. Recognition. Coins bore stamps from rulers or city-states. Their legitimacy was clear across regions. Trade could now cross territories with minimal risk. Coins as political tools. Coins weren't just economic instruments, they were propaganda. Rulers stamped their images or symbols on coins. Every coin circulated their authority. Every trade reinforced their power. Money became both medium and message. Coinage and the expansion of markets. With coins, markets exploded. Long-distance trade became practical. Merchants could transact with strangers confidently. Prices became comparable across regions. Coins created the first truly impersonal economy. Trust was no longer in people or temples. Trust was in metal and authority combined. Accounting meets coinage. Coins didn't make ledgers obsolete. Temples and early states still recorded obligations. But now those records could reference tangible, standardized units. You didn't need to remember the weight of silver bars. You counted coins. Numbers became reality. The psychological leap. Before coins, value was relational. Obligation mattered more than the object. Coins changed perception. Value could exist outside relationships. Exchange could be impersonal. Trade could scale beyond communities. Money became abstract, portable, and universal. The first challenges. Not everyone embraced coins immediately.
Some resisted abstraction. Some doubted stamps or purity. Some preferred traditional obligations. Transition took time. Trust in the new system grew gradually, reinforced by repeated use and authority. Coins and inequality. Coins also accelerated social stratification. Accumulated coins could be saved. Wealth could be concentrated. Generations could inherit money, not just land or goods. Coins didn't just facilitate trade, they reshaped society. From local to regional economies. Coins enabled trade across villages, cities, and regions, specialized professions supported by reliable payment, the development of markets that didn't depend on personal relationships. A potter in one city could sell to a merchant from another city without ever meeting them again. Trade became impersonal and scalable. The final step before modern money. At this stage, coins standardized weight, material, and value. Authority guaranteed legitimacy. Trade became impersonal. Credit could evolve into banks. Humans had moved from social memory to abstract portable value. And with this, the foundations of modern economics were quietly set in place.
Once coins existed, the next step was obvious. Everyone wanted them. Not just for convenience, not just for portability, but for trust. Coins were a universal promise, accepted across cities, regions, and even distant lands. How coinage spread. Lydia started it. Greek city-states refined it. Persia, India, and China quickly adopted variations. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers carried coins wherever they went. Coins spread faster than ideas, languages, and even laws. Wherever a coin was accepted, trade became instant and impersonal. Coins and long-distance trade. Before coins, long-distance trade relied on barter, obligation, and trust. Now, a merchant could cross seas and deserts, buying, selling, and paying without knowing anyone personally. Silk from China reached the Mediterranean. Amber traveled from northern Europe to Greece. Spices crossed deserts to reach Egypt. Coins were the glue that held these distant economies together. Cultural implications. Coins did more than facilitate trade. They carried culture. Images of rulers reinforced political legitimacy. Symbols of gods or animals spread religious ideas. Inscriptions spread literacy and shared understanding. Every coin was a miniature ambassador. Every transaction reinforced a shared system of values. Coins and the rise of markets. With standardized currency, local markets became regional. Regional markets became international. Merchants could specialize confidently. Trade became a career. Professions developed. Craftsmanship improved. Coins allowed economies to scale without scaling personal relationships. The psychological shift. Humans now treated value objectively. Before, value was relational, situational, dependent on trust. After, value was standardized, measurable, transferable. Coins separated wealth from the individual. Your reputation no longer solely dictated your access to trade. The risks of coinage. Coins solved many problems, but created new ones. Counterfeiting became possible. Hoarding concentrated wealth. Societies became vulnerable to theft and corruption. Trade became more efficient, but also more impersonal, more competitive, and more unequal. Coins and governance. Rulers discovered coins were powerful tools. Taxes could be collected efficiently. Armies could be paid consistently. Infrastructure projects could be funded. Coins became instruments of state control as much as trade. Power and money became intertwined. Authority and economic influence became inseparable. Everyday life transformed. Coins changed how ordinary people interacted with trade. Farmers could sell surplus without needing a barter partner. Artisans could earn a living through multiple buyers. Labor could be quantified and compensated consistently. Life became measurable. Wealth became portable. Economic mobility became possible for some. The end of relational trade. By this stage, memory and trust were no longer sufficient. Tokens and tallies were still used in some contexts, but coins dominated large-scale trade. Trade had moved from personal obligation to universal exchange. The Quiet Revolution. What started as shells, beads, and grain had transformed into metal, stamped, and trusted. Trade had gone from immediate barter to memory-based credit, to object-based tokens, to metal weighed by authority, to standardized coinage, all in a slow, almost unconscious evolution. Humans didn't invent money overnight. They grew into it, step by step, century by century. The stage is set. Coins didn't just make trade easier. They expanded the scale of economies, centralized power, abstracted value from relationships, transformed culture and daily life. And from here, civilizations were ready for banks, paper money, international commerce, modern economies, all because humans had learned to trust objects more than memory. By the time coins became widespread, trade was no longer just local. It crossed cities, regions, even empires. But coins had limits. You could carry only so much metal. Long-distance trade required bulk. Large transactions were risky. Humans needed a way to move value without physically moving metal. And that's where credit and early banking systems emerged. The birth of credit in cities. In bustling cities like Babylon, Athens, and Rome, merchants didn't rely solely on coins. They issued promises to pay later. They accepted letters of credit. They trusted temples or private institutions to guarantee repayment. Credit allowed merchants to expand trade networks without carrying tons of metal. Temples as proto-banks. Temples had already been storing grain and recording obligations. Now they began storing metal coins. Deposits were recorded on clay tablets or other ledgers. Depositors could withdraw or transfer coins later, sometimes even to people in other cities. The temple wasn't just a religious center. It became a financial institution long before banks existed. Private lending and early merchants. Not all credit was institutional. Wealthy merchants lent coins or goods for interest. Letters or tokens acted as guarantees. Contracts formalized obligations across distances. This system allowed trade to grow faster than any single city could handle. Standardization meets innovation. Credit required rules, standard weights and measures, verified metal purity, written or symbolic records of debt. These innovations made trade predictable and safe, even across borders. Merchants could now calculate profit and risk systematically. Coins, credit, and trust networks.
trust shifted again, from personal relationships to institutions to contracts and standardized money. You didn't need to know the person anymore. You only needed to trust the system. Societies now relied on social, institutional, and abstract trust simultaneously, expanding trade beyond local markets. With coins and credit, regional markets became integrated, long-distance trade flourished, specialization and division of labor accelerated. A single merchant could operate in multiple cities without moving all physical goods himself. Trade became modular and scalable. The psychological leap of credit. Early humans had to adapt mentally. Value no longer needed immediate physical confirmation. Obligations could be abstracted and delayed. Written records and institutional guarantees replaced personal memory. Credit trained humans to think about future exchange, not just immediate consumption. Banks as intermediaries. Eventually, private and semi-public institutions acted as intermediaries, accepting deposits, lending funds, ensuring repayment, facilitating distant trade. This was the first modern banking model, still primitive but functional. Society changes alongside trade. Credit and early banking didn't just move money, they moved power. Those who controlled lending became influential. Opportunity, merchants could expand rapidly. Inequality, wealth concentrated in new ways. Money was no longer just an economic tool. It became a social and political instrument. The invisible web of trade. By now, economies had evolved into complex networks. Coins circulated widely. Credit allowed promises to move farther than metal. Temples, banks, and merchants ensured trust. Trade had become abstract, standardized, and scalable. Humans were no longer limited to barter, memory, or local markets. They were thinking in terms of systems, not just transactions. The stage for modern economies. By the end of this phase, trade was no longer personal. Money had been abstracted from goods. Credit and records allowed trust to transcend distance. The foundations were laid for national currencies, international banking, and global commerce. All of this grew from simple human innovations: shells, tokens, memory, metal, and trust. By now, coins and credit were firmly established in major cities. Trade was no longer limited by geography or memory. It could expand across empires, touching people who would never meet. But managing this complexity required systems, institutions, and rules. The rise of banking institutions. Temples and wealthy merchants had already been storing deposits and lending coins. Now, more formalized banking systems began to appear. Private bankers held deposits. They facilitated loans. They guaranteed payments for trade. Banks didn't just store money, they managed trust at scale, making large and distant trade feasible. Credit as a tool for growth. Credit allowed merchants to invest in larger ventures, hire workers without upfront coins, transport goods across regions. Credit became a multiplier for economic activity. It wasn't just wealth stored, it was potential wealth unleashed. Interest and risk management. With lending came the need to manage risk. How likely was a borrower to repay? How much could be lent safely? What collateral could ensure repayment? Early bankers developed basic financial principles: interest rates to compensate risk, guarantees and pledges, written contracts or tokens as proof. These were the building blocks of modern finance. The social effects of banking. Banks changed more than trade. They concentrated wealth and influence. They created new professions, scribes, bankers, accountants. They changed the social order, giving rise to economic elites. Those who controlled credit controlled power. Trade became inseparable from politics. Standardization across regions. For credit to work across cities, standards were necessary. Coins had to be recognized across territories. Weights and measures had to be consistent. Contracts had to be understandable. This standardization allowed intercity trade networks, reliable taxation systems, predictable markets. Humans were now thinking in terms of systems, not just barter. Trade networks expanded. With banking and credit, long-distance trade exploded. Silk, spices, and metals crossed continents. Merchants coordinated transactions without ever meeting. Trade became modular: deposits, letters of credit, and coin transfers. Money and credit became detached from personal interaction. The psychological shift. Humans now had to internalize abstract value. Coins could represent labor, goods, or debt. Promises could travel further than objects. Trust shifted from people to institutions. This was a new way of thinking. Value no longer existed solely in the tangible. It existed in records, agreements, and reputation. The emergence of early markets. With reliable credit and banking, markets became permanent. Merchants could plan production. Consumers could predict prices. Cities could support diverse crafts and industries. Trade was no longer episodic. It was continuous, systematic, and scalable. Risk, regulation, and authority. The growth of banking brought new challenges. Defaults could destabilize entire networks. Counterfeit coins threatened trust. Fraudulent promises undermined confidence. This required oversight. Temples or authorities monitored transactions. Regulations ensured fairness. Record-keeping became essential. Economics became intertwined with governance. Laying the groundwork for modern finance. By the end of this era, money was standardized and widely accepted. Credit could move across cities and regions. Banking institutions managed risk and ensured trust. Trade became impersonal but massively efficient. The foundations were set for national currencies, international trade, and complex economies, all built on centuries of incremental innovation: memory, tokens, metal, coins, credit, and banking.
By now, coins were no longer just metal. They were symbols of authority, culture, and power. Empires realized if everyone accepted your coin, you didn't just control trade, you controlled perception of legitimacy. Coins as political statements. Early rulers discovered a unique property of coins. They circulated far and wide. They carried stamped images and inscriptions. They reinforced authority every time someone used them. A single coin could proclaim, "I am ruler here. My decree is recognized. My power is real." Coins became miniature ambassadors of the state. Standardization across the empire. Empires needed uniformity for efficient trade. Every coin had the same weight. Every coin had the same metal purity. Denominations were clearly marked. Merchants traveling across the empire could now trade confidently. No local variation, no confusion over value. Economic integration. Standardized coinage transformed economies. Local markets merged into regional networks. Long-distance trade became predictable. Specialized labor and craftsmanship flourished. Coins allowed cities hundreds of miles apart to interact seamlessly. Coins spread culture. Coins weren't just about economics, they carried messages. Images of gods or rulers spread religion and ideology. Symbols reinforced cultural identity. Inscriptions spread literacy and communication. Every transaction reinforced shared societal norms. Trade networks expand globally. With standardized coins and credit support, goods moved across continents. Silk, spices, metals, and luxury items reached new markets. Credit systems allowed merchants to operate without moving massive physical wealth. Trade had become a complex web of value and trust, stretching across lands and peoples. Coins and psychological change. Humans now viewed value in a completely new way, abstract, not tied to personal relationships or physical objects, quantifiable, standardized weights and denominations, portable, easy to carry and store. Coins trained the mind to see value as symbolic, separable from the physical world. Empires and control of money. Controlling coin production meant controlling economy, who could trade and how much, politics, funding armies and projects, society, reinforcing social hierarchy. Money was no longer just a medium, it was a tool of governance. The seeds of modern trade. By integrating coins, credit, and early banking, markets became larger and more reliable. Wealth could accumulate in new ways. Economies became scalable and complex. Humans could now engage in trade across distances, cultures, and generations. The invisible infrastructure. Behind every coin, trusted authorities, standardized systems, ledgers and records, networks of merchants and institutions. Trade had evolved from memory and trust into a structured system that could survive centuries. The stage was set. Coins didn't just facilitate trade, they centralized power, standardized value, integrated culture, expanded markets. From small tokens and tally sticks to empire-spanning currency, humans had accidentally invented the foundations of the global economy. By the end of antiquity, trade had evolved remarkably. Coins were everywhere. Credit systems were operational. Banks, or at least institutions functioning like banks, existed. But the fall of empires threatened continuity. Trade had to adapt. Surviving the collapse. When Rome fell, long-distance networks fractured. Local trade became dominant again. Coins remained valuable, but supply varied. Temples and authorities that once guaranteed trust were gone. Yet merchants found a way. Credit and trust networks persisted. Letters of credit, promissory notes, and merchant guilds carried trade forward. Even in fragmented political landscapes, commerce endured. Merchant guilds and early banking. By the early medieval period, merchant guilds regulated trade. Trusted families acted as lenders and bankers. Letters of credit allowed trade without physically moving coins. Italy, particularly Venice, Florence, and Genoa, became hubs. Merchants exchanged metal, goods, and promises seamlessly. Banking became professionalized, supporting trade across regions and seas.
coins remain central. Even as credit grew, coins stayed vital. Everyday transactions still required small denominations. Coins provided a tangible standard of value. Rulers minted coins to assert control and collect taxes. Coins and credit worked together. Coins for immediate trade, credit for large, distant, or delayed transactions. International trade expanded. Trade networks now spanned the Mediterranean, Northern Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Luxury goods, spices, metals, textiles, and ideas flowed together. Credit and banking allowed risk to be managed across oceans. The psychological evolution continues. Humans now, trusted symbols and abstract agreements over physical objects, could think in terms of scalable economies, accepted institutions as arbiters of value. Trade no longer depended on memory or personal trust. It relied on systems, records, and enforceable contracts. The precursors to modern money. Medieval trade innovations introduced bills of exchange, orally checks, letters of credit, deposit and lending systems, standardized coinage across regions. These systems made trade more efficient, reliable, and expansive. Society transforms alongside trade. With these systems, merchants gained influence, cities grew wealthy, craft specialization increased, and wealth accumulation became more pronounced. Trade shaped society as much as society shaped trade. The continuous thread. From shells, tally sticks, and tokens, to coins, temples, and early banks, to merchant guilds and letters of credit, humans had been steadily abstracting value, expanding trust networks, and building scalable economies. Trade was no longer limited to what could be carried, remembered, or guaranteed by a single authority. It had become an interconnected, dynamic system capable of spanning continents. The stage is set for modern finance. By the medieval period, the foundations of modern banking and commerce were firmly in place. Standardized currency, credit and promissory instruments, institutional trust, long-distance trade networks. All of this grew naturally from centuries of experimentation and adaptation. By the late medieval period, trade and finance had matured significantly. Coins, credit, and banking were no longer novelties. They were the lifeblood of commerce. Yet new pressures were reshaping the economic landscape. Why innovation was necessary? Long-distance trade was booming. Italian city-states dominated Mediterranean commerce. Hanseatic League controlled Northern European trade. Spices and silk traveled thousands of miles from Asia. With wealth moving faster than ever, new systems were required to manage risk, facilitate large transactions, and ensure repayment across vast distances. Letters of exchange. Merchants developed letters of exchange, the precursor to checks and modern credit notes. A merchant deposited coins with a banker in one city, received a letter promising equivalent value elsewhere. The recipient could redeem coins without carrying metal. This system allowed international trade to flourish safely. Banking families and institutions. Certain families became synonymous with banking, the Medici in Florence, the Fuggers in Germany. They financed trade expeditions, lent money to monarchs, and managed complex networks of deposits and credit. Banks were no longer just storage houses. They controlled economic power, influencing politics and society. Coins and standardization continued. Coins remained crucial for small-scale trade. Rulers standardized them to collect taxes efficiently, fund armies and infrastructure, and facilitate commerce across regions. Standardization reinforced trust in the system and reduced disputes. The birth of early capitalism. With credit, banking, and coins combined, merchants could take larger risks. Investments could fund production, shipping, and trade. Profit potential increased dramatically. Economies were now capable of growth beyond local resources, setting the stage for capitalism. Risk and innovation. Trade and finance had inherent risks: shipwrecks, theft, defaults, currency fluctuation. These challenges encouraged innovations: insurance, partnerships, diversification of trade, sophisticated contracts. Humans learned to quantify uncertainty, a critical step in modern finance. Expansion of markets. With improved banking and credit, markets expanded geographically. Goods, ideas, and culture spread. Merchants could operate regionally or internationally. Trade was now impersonal but highly efficient, decoupling exchange from personal relationships. Social implications. The rise of banking and early capitalism reshapes society. Merchants gained unprecedented influence. Cities became economic hubs. Wealth accumulation created new social classes. Labor specialization and urbanization increased. Economic power became centralized yet mobile, transcending local allegiances. The psychological leap. Humans adapted to abstract systems of value. Trust was placed in institutions rather than individuals. Value could be measured, transferred, and stored independently. Risk and reward became formalized. Money, credit, and banking taught societies to operate on principles of abstraction and foresight. The stage for the modern world. By the end of the medieval period, coins were standardized, credit networks spanned regions, banks managed wealth and facilitated trade. Early capitalism encouraged investment, risk-taking, and economic growth. Humans had evolved from barter to memory to tokens to metal to coins to credit to banking to early capitalism. This chain of innovation laid the groundwork for modern global economies, setting the stage for industrialization, international finance, and contemporary trade. By the late medieval period, trade networks had matured within regions, but the real transformation came when these networks expanded across continents. Europe, Asia, and Africa were no longer isolated. Coins, credit, and banking facilitated the first true global commerce. Maritime trade networks. Ships replaced caravans as the backbone of long-distance trade. The Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and South China Sea became highways of commerce. Merchants transported spices, silk, metals, and luxury goods. Letters of credit and banking networks allowed them to move wealth safely. No longer constrained by geography, trade could span oceans and climates. The role of standardized currency. Coins and standardized units remained essential. Merchants could convert local currency into widely accepted forms. Banking houses ensured reliable exchanges between regions. Standardization reduced disputes and facilitated trust across cultures. Coins became universal symbols of value, recognized far beyond their city of origin. Credit across borders. Letters of credit,
Promissory notes and banking networks allowed merchants to conduct transactions without physically moving coins, trade safely in foreign ports, manage risk over long distances. Credit allowed wealth to move faster than ships or caravans could. Cultural and political implications. Global trade spread more than goods. Ideas, religions, and technologies traveled with merchants. Coins carried symbols of rulers, gods, or empires far from home. Trade reinforced political and cultural influence across regions. Money became a medium for cultural exchange as well as economic exchange. The expansion of markets. With global networks, markets were no longer local or regional. Prices could be compared across continents. Specialized production became profitable. A silk weaver in China could supply Europe without ever meeting the buyer. A European merchant could profit from spices sourced in India. Trade became modular, scalable, and impersonal. Risk management and innovation. Long-distance trade introduced new risks: shipwrecks, pirates, exchange rate fluctuations, political instability. Merchants and banks innovated: maritime insurance, hedging through letters of credit, diversification of trade routes. These innovations created resilient economic systems capable of supporting global trade. Psychological evolution of value. Humans increasingly relied on institutions rather than individuals for trust. Abstraction of value from tangible goods. Measurement and prediction and planning in commerce. Trade became a system of relationships between ideas, contracts, and promises, not just objects. The foundations of modern commerce. Global trade combined centuries of human experimentation, barter to memory to tokens to metal to coins to credit to regional trade to global trade. Each step added efficiency, scalability, trust mechanisms, and abstract systems of value. By connecting continents, humans had created the first interconnected global economy, paving the way for modern commerce and finance. The human leap. What began as simple exchanges for survival had become a complex system of value, trust, and abstraction. Trade had transformed society through wealth, power, and specialization, culture through coins, credit, and cross-cultural exchange, psychology by teaching humans to conceptualize and trust systems beyond personal experience. The stage was now set for the modern age of commerce. By the 15th and 16th centuries, trade had become truly global. Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas were increasingly connected. Coins, credit, and banking systems had matured, allowing commerce to operate on an unprecedented scale. The age of exploration. European nations sought new trade routes. Portugal sailed around Africa to India. Spain crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. England and the Netherlands followed with global expeditions. These voyages were not just about discovery, they were about accessing goods, markets, and wealth. Coins, credit, and risk. Long-distance trade brought enormous risks. Storms, shipwrecks, and piracy threatened cargo. Fluctuating exchange rates made profits unpredictable. Political conflicts could seize goods or block trade. Credit systems and banks mitigated some of these risks. Letters of credit allowed merchants to pay far-off partners. Banking houses issued loans to fund voyages.
Insurance schemes emerged to protect against losses. Trade could now operate across oceans without moving all the physical money. Emergence of multinational companies. The era saw the rise of early corporations, Dutch East India Company, VOC, British East India Company. These companies controlled trade across multiple regions, managed their own fleets, banks, and warehouses, issued shares to investors, distributing risk and profit. This was the beginning of multinational commerce. Coins and currency across borders. Currency standardization remained critical. Local coins were exchanged for widely accepted bullion. Banking networks ensured reliable conversion. Merchants could operate in multiple regions without fear of fraud. Money had become portable, abstract, and universal, capable of spanning continents. Credit and early stock markets. Investment grew beyond individual merchants. Shares allowed multiple investors to fund ventures. Profit and risk were shared. Trading of shares led to the first organized financial markets. Humans were learning to formalize and quantify economic relationships, creating systems that resemble modern capitalism. Impact on society. The expansion of trade and finance transformed social structures. Merchants gained political influence. Cities became hubs of wealth, culture, and innovation. Labor specialization increased as global markets demanded specific goods. Wealth could now move independently of land, birth, or social status. Trade had become a driver of societal evolution. The psychological shift continues. Humans adapted to increasingly abstract systems. Trust in institutions and contracts became paramount. Value was increasingly symbolic and recorded. Economic decisions involved forecasting, risk analysis, and planning. Commerce was no longer a matter of survival. It was strategic, systemic, and far-reaching. Global trade and cultural exchange. Trade networks facilitated more than just goods. Ideas, technology, and culture spread across continents. Coins and banking practices introduced European systems worldwide. Merchants acted as conduits for cross-cultural interaction. Money and credit now served as tools of cultural as well as economic exchange. Foundations for modern economics. By the early modern period, coins, credit, and banking were well established. Trade networks spanned continents. Early corporations enabled investment and risk sharing. Finance became a mechanism for scaling commerce. The evolution from barter to global financial systems had reached a new height. The human leap. From shells and tokens to coins, credit, and multinational companies, humans had learned to abstract value, scale trade beyond immediate communities, trust institutions over individuals, quantify and manage risk. This set the stage for the Industrial Revolution, modern banking, and global markets.
By the 17th and early 18th centuries, global trade networks were deeply interconnected. Coins, credit, banks, and multinational ventures had become the backbone of international commerce. But these systems now began reshaping societies, economies, and politics. Economic centralization. Global trade concentrated wealth in key hubs. Cities like Amsterdam, London, Lisbon, and Venice thrived. Banking families and merchant guilds accumulated immense influence. Ports became centers for finance, commerce, and innovation. Trade shifted power from feudal lords to merchant classes and financial institutions. Standardization and trust at scale.
To support expanding networks, coins were standardized across regions, banking networks ensured credit could travel safely, letters of exchange and promissory notes became common. Humans increasingly trusted systems over individuals. Commerce no longer depended on local relationships, it depended on institutional reliability. Cultural and knowledge exchange. Trade brought more than goods. Navigational knowledge, technology, and scientific ideas spread. Cultural practices and art crossed continents. Economic literacy expanded as merchants learned bookkeeping, accounting, and risk management. The globalization of commerce accelerated human innovation and cultural integration. The rise of early capitalist economies. With banking, credit, and multinational companies, investment could fund large-scale ventures. Risk was distributed among multiple stakeholders. Profit-driven systems emerged, incentivizing efficiency and innovation. Trade was no longer just survival, it was strategic wealth creation. Social implications. Economic changes reshaped societies. A new class of merchants and financiers gained influence. Cities became more cosmopolitan and socially complex. Labor specialization increased to meet global demand. Wealth could be inherited and accumulated independently of land or birth. The social fabric began to revolve around commerce, not just agriculture or feudal ties. Psychological and cognitive changes. Humans adapted to abstract economic thinking. Value was no longer tangible. It could exist as credit, coins, or stock. Risk management and long-term planning became essential. Trust shifted from people to systems, institutions, and documentation. Economic activity became predictable, scalable, and measurable. Political implications. Global trade reshaped governance. States taxed commerce and regulated markets. Mercantilist policies sought to maximize wealth through trade. Financial power influenced political decisions and wars. Commerce and power were intertwined. Money was both tool and authority. Infrastructure and innovation. Trade networks encouraged physical and intellectual infrastructure. Roads, ports, and warehouses expanded. Accounting, ledgers, and banking software evolved. Maritime knowledge and cartography advanced. Economic demands drove technological and administrative innovation. The foundation of the industrial age. By connecting continents and standardizing systems of money, credit, and trade, human societies were primed for industrialization. Resources could be mobilized efficiently, labor could be organized on an unprecedented scale, capital could be accumulated and reinvested. Trade and finance had become the engines of societal transformation. The human leap. From simple barter to global commerce, trade evolved across millennia. Coins, credit, and banking created trust at scale. Markets became impersonal, systematic, and global. Societies, economies, and cultures were reshaped. The groundwork for modern economies, industrialization, and globalization had been laid. By the late 18th century, global trade, banking, and credit systems had matured, but these systems now began fueling massive economic transformation. Markets, previously regional or transcontinental, became the foundation for industrial-scale production. Capital accumulation. Global trade created wealth on an unprecedented scale. Merchants and financiers accumulated capital beyond what small-scale commerce could generate. Banking systems allowed reinvestment of profits into productive ventures. Investments could fund manufacturing, infrastructure, and exploration. Capital was no longer tied solely to land or traditional aristocracy. It became portable, liquid, and scalable. Financial instruments and innovation. Merchants and bankers developed tools to manage increasingly complex economies. Bills of exchange facilitated long-distance trade. Shares allowed risk to be spread among multiple investors. Credit and insurance mitigated financial risk. These innovations enabled larger and more ambitious ventures, laying the groundwork for industrial capitalism. Labor specialization and urbanization. The growth of trade and finance encouraged social and economic organization. Specialized crafts and production centers emerged in cities. Urbanization concentrated labor, skills, and knowledge. Economies became more efficient as workers and resources were coordinated. Trade and finance had created the necessary human and organizational infrastructure for industry. Standardization and predictability. Standardized coins, weights, measures, and credit systems allowed for predictable costs and prices, efficient contracts and contracts enforcement, reliable long-distance trade and supply chains. These systems reduced uncertainty, allowing large-scale industrial planning. Global influence and expansion. The reach of European trade networks meant raw materials could be sourced globally, manufactured goods could reach distant markets, credit systems and banking networks could finance expansive operations. Economies became interconnected, creating a truly global economic system. Societal shifts. The expansion of commerce and finance reshaped society. New wealth challenged traditional aristocracies. Social mobility increased through trade and investment. Cities became centers of innovation and culture. The very concept of value, wealth, and labor had evolved from barter and coins to abstract economic systems. The psychological leap. Humans had now internalized abstract representation of wealth, systems-based trust over personal trust, strategic risk-taking, and long-term planning. Economic decision-making was no longer purely local or immediate. It became systemic, predictive, and scalable. Foundations for industrialization. With accumulated capital, efficient trade networks, standardized money and credit, banking and investment systems, labor specialization, societies were ready for industrial production, mechanization, and global economic integration. The human journey in commerce. From shells and beads to coins, credit, and multinational commerce, humans had gradually abstracted value, created scalable trust networks, developed systems capable of spanning continents, built the foundation for the modern global economy. Trade and finance had become tools of human progress, enabling civilizations to think bigger, move further, and innovate faster than ever before. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, centuries of financial innovation, credit, and trade networks set the stage for industrialization. Trade had expanded across continents, banking systems were robust, and credit allowed unprecedented mobilization of capital. From merchant capital to industrial capital. Industrialization required large-scale investments, factories, machines, transportation infrastructure. Wealth accumulated through trade and banking could now be directed toward production, not just exchange. Merchant capital became industrial capital. Banking facilitated loans for machinery, mines, and shipping. Investors could fund ventures with confidence using standardized systems of credit and trust. Scale and specialization. Industrial production relied on large workforces in urban centers, division of labor to maximize efficiency, standardized components and processes. Trade networks ensured that raw materials could be imported and finished goods exported efficiently. Credit systems and financial instruments made it possible to coordinate these massive operations. Global market integration. Industrialization intensified globalization. Manufactured goods from Europe reached Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Raw materials flowed back to industrial centers. Financial networks, letters of credit, and banking institutions managed transactions at enormous scale. Trade was no longer episodic, it was continuous and systematic, connecting production, finance, and consumption globally. The role of banking and credit. Banks became central to industrial expansion, issuing loans for factories and railroads, facilitating international trade, managing investment risk. Letters of credit, bills of exchange, and insurance allowed entrepreneurs to take risks that were previously impossible. Societal transformations. Industrialization reshaped society profoundly. Urbanization concentrated labor, skills, and innovation. Wealth and power shifted toward industrialists and financiers. Social mobility increased through trade, investment, and entrepreneurship. Cities became hubs of commerce, culture, and governance. Economic power became dynamic and scalable, no longer tied solely to land or aristocracy. Psychological and cultural changes. Humans internalized new ways of thinking about value and trade. Trust shifted to systems, contracts, and institutions. Value was measured abstractly in currency, stocks, and credit. Risk and reward became calculable and manageable. These cognitive adaptations enabled industrial economies to operate efficiently at scale. Trade and industrial innovation. Global trade spurred innovation. Access to raw materials inspired new manufacturing methods. Competition encouraged efficiency and quality. International markets incentivized mass production. Industrial economies were built on centuries of accumulated knowledge in trade, finance, and credit. The foundation for modern economies. By the industrial era, money and credit were abstract, standardized, and global. Banking systems facilitated investment and risk sharing. Trade networks connected continents efficiently. Labor and production could be coordinated on unprecedented scales. Civilizations had transformed from barter societies to industrial economies powered by abstract financial systems. The human leap in economic systems. From shells and tally sticks to coins, credit, and multinational commerce, humans had abstracted value from the physical, created scalable networks of trust, developed institutions to manage risk, mobilized capital and labor globally. Industrialization was the culmination of millennia of human innovation in trade, finance, and trust, reshaping society and laying the foundation for the modern world. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization had transformed economies. Global trade networks, banking systems, and credit instruments had matured, creating an interconnected financial ecosystem. The growth of industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism relied on several key factors: large-scale production, efficient transportation and logistics, access to raw materials worldwide, financial systems capable of supporting investment and risk. Banks, insurance companies, and stock markets enabled entrepreneurs to fund massive projects from railroads to factories. Standardization and predictability. Standardization continued to play a critical role. Weights, measures, and currencies were regulated. Accounting and bookkeeping systems became formalized. Legal systems enforced contracts and trade agreements. This predictability allowed businesses to plan, expand, and innovate globally. International trade expansion. Trade networks connected continents like never before. Europe exported manufactured goods to Asia and the Americas. Raw materials flowed into industrial centers. Financial institutions and letters of credit enabled large-scale international transactions. Trade was no longer local or episodic. It became systematic, global, and continuous. Banks as engines of growth. Banks became central to industrial economies, facilitating long-term loans for infrastructure and production, managing investment risk across continents, supporting multinational corporations. Trust shifted from personal relationships to institutions and contracts, allowing commerce to scale. The role of stock markets. Stock markets enabled broader participation in economic growth. Investors could fund industrial ventures. Risk was distributed among multiple stakeholders. Profits were shared and reinvested. Financial innovation accelerated industrial expansion and global trade. Societal impacts. Industrial capitalism reshaped societies. Urbanization concentrated labor, skills, and commerce. Wealth and influence shifted to industrialists and financiers. Social mobility increased through trade, investment, and entrepreneurship. Education and technical skills became valuable commodities. Economies became dynamic, scalable, and increasingly impersonal, driven by systems rather than individuals. Psychological and cultural shifts. Humans adapted to increasingly abstract economic systems. Trust in institutions replaced reliance on personal relationships. Value became symbolic and recorded, stocks, credit, and bonds. Economic planning, forecasting, and risk analysis became common. Societies internalized systems thinking in economics, enabling unprecedented coordination. Innovation in trade and logistics. Industrial economies required efficient shipping, railways, and canals, standardized packaging and units of measurement, reliable communication and record-keeping. These innovations allowed trade to operate at industrial scale, connecting distant markets seamlessly. The foundation for globalized economies. By the early 20th century, money, credit, and banking were abstract, standardized, and global. Trade networks spanned continents efficiently. Industrial production could be coordinated with global markets. Capital and labor could be mobilized and scaled systematically. Human economies had evolved from simple barter to complex, interdependent global systems, laying the groundwork for the modern financial world. The human leap in global commerce. From shells and beads to coins, credit, banking, and industrial capitalism, humans had abstracted value from the physical, built scalable trust networks, developed institutions to manage risk and investment, mobilized capital, labor, and resources on a global scale. The early 20th century represented the refinement of millennia of economic evolution, creating the structures that define modern global trade. By the early 20th century, industrial capitalism and global trade had matured,
but new challenges and opportunities emerged. World markets were increasingly interconnected yet fragile, shaped by finance, policy, and technology. The rise of global financial systems. Banking and finance had evolved from simple loans and coins to complex transnational systems. International banks coordinated currency exchanges. Letters of credit and promissory notes moved wealth across continents. Early central banks regulated money supply and stabilized trade. Trade now depended on institutional trust at a global scale rather than personal relationships. Impact of world wars. World War I disrupted trade networks. Shipping routes were blocked or destroyed. Currencies fluctuated wildly. Governments borrowed heavily, relying on banks to finance war efforts. Yet, these disruptions also accelerated innovation. Standardized contracts and accounting practices became essential. Financial institutions adapted to manage large-scale risk. Trade began to rely even more on global systems rather than local trust. The interwar period. After World War I, nations attempted to rebuild trade networks. New financial instruments emerged, including bonds, futures, and insurance innovations. International conferences sought to stabilize currency and trade. This period demonstrated the necessity of robust global economic systems for sustained commerce. Technological and logistical innovations. Trade relied on both infrastructure and technology. Railways, steamships, and telegraphs accelerated communication. Standardized shipping containers simplified transport. Banking records and bookkeeping software, manual ledgers, managed complex transactions. Global commerce became faster, more reliable, and more scalable. Cultural and social impacts. Economic globalization began shaping societies. Urbanization continued as labor moved to industrial centers. Financial literacy spread through education and commerce. Social mobility and entrepreneurship became tied to engagement with global markets. Trade influenced culture as much as economy, spreading ideas, practices, and innovation worldwide. Credit, banking, and risk management. The interwar period highlighted the importance of risk management. Credit allowed trade to continue even during economic instability. Banks and financial institutions ensured ventures against defaults and market fluctuations. Currency stabilization mechanisms were introduced to reduce cross-border uncertainty. Humans had learned to formalize, abstract, and systematize trust on a global scale. Preparation for modern globalization. By the 1930s, trade networks had adapted to crises. Banking and financial instruments were sophisticated and resilient. Nations were beginning to coordinate monetary policy and trade agreements. The stage was set for post-World War II economic globalization, building directly on centuries of trade, finance, and industrial evolution. The human leap. From shells and coins to credit, banking, and multinational trade, humans developed systems capable of sustaining economies across continents. Abstract value and institutional trust became central to commerce. Industrialization and global networks created unprecedented economic scale. The interwar period was a critical bridge between early global trade and contemporary globalization, demonstrating the power of well-structured financial and trade systems. After World War II, the world faced both devastation and opportunity. Trade networks had been disrupted, but reconstruction and innovation sparked unprecedented economic growth and globalization. Rebuilding global trade. The post-war era required coordinated efforts to restore commerce. Nations rebuilt ports, railways, and shipping routes. New institutions like the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and World Bank stabilized economies. Agreements such as GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, promoted international trade. Trade was no longer ad hoc, it was regulated, predictable, and increasingly global. Modern banking and financial systems. Banking evolved to handle complex global economies. Central banks coordinated monetary policy. Commercial banks offered international loans. Investment banks facilitated cross-border capital flows. Credit and financial instruments became sophisticated, allowing multinational corporations to fund ventures worldwide. Industrial and technological expansion. Post-war industrialization accelerated global trade. Mass production lowered costs and increased output. Container shipping standardized logistics. Communication technologies, from telegraphs to early computers, improved coordination. Trade was faster, safer, and more scalable than ever before. The rise of multinational corporations. Corporations expanded across borders. Businesses operated factories, warehouses, and offices worldwide. Capital and labor were coordinated globally. Standardized accounting, currency exchange, and banking facilitated growth. Global corporations became both economic and cultural forces, spreading products, technology, and ideas. Global financial instruments. Trade and investment relied on sophisticated instruments. Bonds, stocks, and derivatives allowed risk sharing. Letters of credit and electronic transfers sped transactions. Insurance and hedging mitigated potential losses. Finance enabled the mobilization of massive resources across continents. Societal impacts. Economic globalization reshaped societies. Urbanization accelerated as labor moved to industrial and financial centers. Social mobility increased through education, trade, and entrepreneurship. Cultural exchange intensified as goods, ideas, and technology flowed freely. Money and credit now structured not just economies, but entire societies. Psychological and cultural shifts. Humans adapted to highly abstract economic systems, trust in institutions and international agreements, strategic planning, risk analysis, and predictive decision-making. Commerce became systematic, measurable, and globally coordinated, a far cry from local barter or even early industrial trade. The foundation of today's global economy. By the late 19th century, financial systems were global, integrated, and complex. Trade networks spanned continents efficiently. Corporations and institutions coordinated capital, labor, and production on a massive scale. Humanity had achieved a level of economic abstraction and coordination unimaginable in early history. The human leap in the modern era. From shells, tally sticks, and coins to credit, banking, industrial capitalism, and multinational trade,
to sophisticated global financial systems supporting modern economies. Humans had learned to abstract value, manage risk, and scale trade globally, creating the foundation for contemporary globalization. Trade and finance were no longer just tools, they were integral to human society, politics, and culture.
By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, human trade had reached a level of abstraction and scale never before seen. Value no longer needed a physical form. Trade no longer required face-to-face trust. Economies moved at the speed of information. This was the culmination of thousands of years of experimentation with exchange, trust, and cooperation. The digital transformation of trade. Computers and the Internet transformed commerce. Transactions became electronic. Banking shifted from paper to digital records. Trade could occur instantly across continents. Money increasingly existed as numbers in databases, not coins or paper. Consumers could purchase goods from anywhere in the world with a few clicks, and companies could coordinate supply chains spanning dozens of countries. Global supply chains. Modern trade depends on intricate global networks. Raw materials sourced from one region, manufacturing in another, assembly, logistics, and distribution across multiple continents. Each step relies on digital records, standardized contracts, and predictable financial systems. Trade is no longer linear, it is networked, interdependent, and dynamic. Financial abstraction at its peak. Modern finance operates almost entirely through abstraction. Credit cards, digital wallets, and online banking. Stock markets driven by algorithms and real-time data. Complex financial instruments representing future value. Trust is embedded in systems, institutions, and technology rather than individuals. The role of central banks and institutions. Central banks and global institutions manage economic stability, controlling money supply, regulating inflation and interest rates, coordinating international financial policy. These institutions represent humanity's collective effort to govern abstract value at massive scale. Cryptocurrency and alternative systems. New experiments challenge traditional finance. Cryptocurrencies propose decentralized trust. Blockchain technology records value transparently. Smart contracts automate exchange without intermediaries. These systems echo ancient trade concepts, trust without centralized authority, but executed through advanced technology. Cultural and psychological shifts. Humans now live inside economic systems constantly. Value fluctuates in real time. Financial decisions shape daily life. Economic awareness is global, not local. Trade influences identity, opportunity, and security in ways early humans could never imagine. Continuities with the past. Despite the complexity, the core remains unchanged. Humans exchange value to meet needs. Trust underpins all trade. Cooperation enables survival and growth. From shells and barter to digital currencies, the human instinct to trade remains constant. The future of trade. Looking forward, trade will continue evolving. Greater automation and artificial intelligence, more digital and decentralized systems,
new definitions of value, labor, and ownership. Yet, every future system will build on the same foundation laid thousands of years ago. A quiet reflection. Long before money, before banks, before markets, humans shared food, tools, and effort. Trade was not about profit, it was about survival, trust, and connection. Every coin, ledger, and digital transaction is a reflection of that ancient instinct to cooperate, to exchange, and to build something larger together. Closing thought. Human trade is not just an economic story. It is a story of relationships, trust, and imagination. From simple exchanges to global systems, humanity has continuously refined one idea: how to share value across time, distance, and difference. And that story is still being written.